Today we're going to talk about some historical isekai, as I'd call them, where modern characters are transported back to a fictionalized past historical period. So they're not technically isekai, but in my opinion, because a new history is being created by this character, that would mean this is a different world, hence isekai. One of these is also a reverse, so I guess in that case it wouldn't be isekai since the guy died before he traveled to the future, so, whatever, who cares. Now, if I had a nickel for every time I read a manga about a modern-day man being sent back to Warring States period Japan, who became heavily involved with Oda Nobunaga, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but I'd also have a third nickel. Wait a second. Who's on the nickel? Thomas Jefferson. Okay, well, I'd also have a really weird nickel where Thomas Jefferson was an anime girl. Moving on. We'll start with Nobunaga no Chef, or A Chef of Nobunaga, or the crappy name The Knife and the Sword. And this one is about a chef, a modern-day Japanese chef, Ken, who is transported back to the Warring States period not too long after Nobunaga becomes like a full-on daimyo. So Nobunaga's already in power, and he uses Ken's unique skills because he's a really good chef, but also because he has modern knowledge of cooking techniques, like a lot of Western stuff that's been incorporated into Japanese cooking nowadays, but also just Western cooking in general, that at the time, nobody in that period in Japan would have the ability to understand or make that kind of stuff, especially outside the capital, where any form of Western cuisine was nigh non-existent. So he's kind of like a status symbol also for Oda Nobunaga. But he also uses Ken's cooking skills to motivate his own troops and demoralize his enemies, and often some more complex stuff in between. I really like seeing the methods Ken has to use to achieve like the same or similar cooking results that he could in our modern age, while having to use Sengoku-era ingredients and tools. Like, I think they didn't have soy sauce at that time, but they did have miso. So he's using like either miso byproduct, like a liquid you could scum off the top of the miso at some point during the process or something like that, or I don't know, maybe it's just like a liquid that's there at some point during the miso making process. So he has to like take that and use it in place of soy sauce, and all kinds of different things in that vein. Ken is also like super, almost unusually knowledgeable about the original history of the Sengoku period, especially pertaining to Oda Nobunaga, which allows him to make certain decisions that help, but also never really seem to have an impact that changes history from its original form. So far, everything I've read is going historically. Obviously reasons why things are happening may not be exactly true to what happened, but the results have been the same. One interesting thing I have thought about is, it seems that Ken doesn't want to let Nobunaga die, at least the way it did. So I'm wondering if eventually this manga is going to stray away from, the big historical events as they happened, or if at the very end maybe he can't prevent it and Nobunaga gets assassinated as he did. Either way, for some reason I love cooking manga, and at this point, this channel should be evidence of my enjoyment of historical manga. This is the 3rd video already. So this is kind of the best of both worlds for me. And there's recipes at the end of each volume, which is cool. So hopefully I'll try out one of these at some point, like I've done with a couple other manga. And I really like the concept for this one, and I appreciate how well researched it is, or at least seems to be. There's extensive lists of the sources the author used at the end of each of the volumes as well. And because of that, I've been using this one sort of as a measuring stick for the historical events presented in other manga set in this period, and we'll talk about a couple of those. This is how I've been learning the most about the Sengoku Jidai, or the Warring States period, at least in terms of Oda Nobunaga related events. And part of this is just because I read it first, but when I read the other works, I'll think back on Nobunaga no Chef and be like, oh yeah, that's this. And obviously, when I actually care to know the specifics or what's real, I'll look into what actually happened. And for the most part, besides Ken being inserted there, it's pretty much exactly how it's presented in the manga, and I really appreciated that. So I think this would be my number 1 recommendation out of this video, and that's why we're talking about it first. Now we've got Nobunaga Concerto, or Nobunaga Concerto. This one's about a poor student Not poor in the monetary sense, just not a good student. And he is also transported back to the Warring States period, and he actually looks so much like Nobunaga that he ends up replacing Oda Nobunaga when the original one leaves his family, for whatever reason. And this is before the death of Oda Nobunaga's father, who was the head of the family at the time, so Oda Nobunaga is not in power yet. Now, contrary to Ken in Nobunaga no Chef, our main character Saburo, who replaces Nobunaga, does not really know his history very well. He has like really basic info that he does know, and I think he also came with a textbook, but it had like very little detail. So otherwise he's kind of just winging it. The only thing he really knows is that Oda Nobunaga wanted to take over the world, essentially, and that he unified / conquered Japan. So that's his whole guiding motivation. And that kind of makes all the more sense, and that kind of makes it all the more interesting to watch him stumble down the path of history that the real original Nobunaga did. And also, like, the stuff I know from Nobunaga no Chef, as that comes up, I'm like, oh, wow, okay, like, that's an interesting way to go about things, or like, that's certainly one way that result could have come about. Like, it kind of does make sense with how Oda Nobunaga's character is presented in other works. And I found Saburo's relationship with his sister and his wife, and really like everybody he meets, especially all his retainers and the town folk and everyone all around, just to be really sweet. Like, he's just a really nice kid, though maybe a bit naive, a bit too naive, which is kind of contrary to how Nobunaga is portrayed historically, at least generally in the West. But it really works with the story because the main thing about Saburo is that he's super impulsive, and that makes sense for a lot of the quick and unexpected or unprecedented decision-making that was so important to the rise of the real Oda Nobunaga. And kind of a spoiler, but we learn early on, within 5 chapters, so I wouldn't say it's a huge twist that is going to affect you reading the story if I tell you now, but Saburo's transportation back to this era is not necessarily an isolated incident, so that's also something interesting to see when you read this story. And there's a 12-episode anime for this, which I didn't know about, so that's cool too. Now for our female Thomas Jefferson Nickel, Oda Nobuna no Yabou, or The Ambition of Oda Nobuna. And I believe this title is a play on Nobunaga's Ambition, which is a video game first released in like the 80s, where you're a daimyo and you're trying to unify all of Japan like Nobunaga, which actually sounds like a pretty cool game. This time, contrary to Saburo, we have an actual good student who gets transported back to the Warring States period, so he'll actually know some of his history. And in this one, he actually ends up replacing Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who dies saving him. But despite him knowing his history, there's still a catch that is going to hinder his progress here, because lots of, but not all, of the warlords here are gender swapped, so they're now female. Also, contrary to our previous 2 Nobunaga-focused manga, this one certainly seems like it's going to change history. Besides the gender stuff, it's already not following it as closely. Like, at least the start of our story, everything is set up to be accurate to our history, but pretty early on we get less death than reality. So it's cool to see things going off the rails in like a different way than the others, but we're still getting all the same historical figures and mostly the same situations. So it's nice to see maybe people not dying, because some of the characters in the other stories and in history are enjoyable to have around, but you know, they die. And here, they don't seem to be doing that as much. Now, I would think, upon initially looking at all the info associated with this series, that it's just like a generic harem type thing, potentially. Or maybe a way to have, like, a lot of girls as sellable merch asset type things, since it's like, oh, we sent a high school boy back, and what? All the warlords are pretty girls now? Now we can sell anime girlified Sengoku warlords. But after watching this anime and then looking into the wiki about the light novel and a bunch of other info I could find out about the light novels, it seems like a very robust and interesting world based upon the Sengoku period. Like, it starts to diverge just at the outset of our story, and it's like the author's own construction, and it looks like it's really something I would want to read. I just wish there was more media of it that I could understand and consume, but unfortunately there's not. My hope is someday we get some sort of translation, though. Also, our main source here is a light novel, which is different, and I'm not reading it because it's not available in English. And shout out to whoever made the English Wikipedia, because this shit is not available enough in English for the level of information on the Wikipedia here. So they must have been like hardcore reading this in Japanese, or maybe there's some translation out there, and I'd love to find it. And also, honestly, the Japanese Wikipedia is one of the longest wikis I've ever seen, so the lore here is super deep, which is all the more exciting to think about. And also, the light novel was adapted into a manga, but it had a pretty limited run in terms of relating to the full series, so I doubt it covers much more than the anime anyways, so I think the anime over the manga, if both are available in English, would be the way to go. But I just wish there was more story I could actually read or watch. Diverging from the Sengoku period, we have Sora wa akai kawa no hotori, or literally, the sky is on the banks of the Red River, which is normally just shortened to Red River, sometimes called Anatolia story. In this, we have a high school girl, and I believe from the 90s, since that's when this manga started, and she gets transported back to about the 1400s BC to the Hittite kingdom. So this is like a very much out there, random but very cool period of history and culture. One thing I want to note real quick is that there is some like magic involved outside of the time travel summoning thing. So I wouldn't call it like straight up historical, but besides the little bits and pieces of magical stuff, all the like kingdoms in the area, as well as a lot of real historical figures, namely rulers being involved, are pretty consistent with the order of events known to history. So I don't think the little bits of magic take anything away from the historical bits of this. And I love how out of left field the era and location both are. We learn about the ancient civilizations of the Anatolian Peninsula, mainly the Hittites, as well as some in the Levant Palestine area and Egypt, because Egypt is fucking ubiquitous in ancient history, so it's always got to be around. And I've already seen multiple civilizations I never knew of before, like the Mitanni, so I really like this exploration of a culture foreign to pretty much most people. Unfortunately, what I did and do not like is this shoujo trope where forcing yourself on a girl enough times, suddenly she just decides she loves you. Like, I get that saving her life means something, but the suspension bridge effect exists. I feel like it's not enough of a reason to love someone, given all the unsolicited forcing upon, but I feel like I've been over this a couple of times now, so I digress. Other than that, it's got some cool female empowerment for being the 1400s BC. It's just like, kind of has to be gone about in a different way. You have to pretend to be a literal goddess, potentially, to be in any sort of position of power. But it's not like these types of things didn't happen. And while our main character Yuri doesn't really know anything about the Hittites, which I can't blame her for, she does have 3,400 years worth of cumulative knowledge as an advantage at her disposal. Like, she knows about iron, which they didn't necessarily know about, which is crazy. And she does a good job of making use of everything she has at her disposal. And I think, besides her inexplicable falling in love with this dude, which I get is kind of the point of the fucking story, she seems to be super intelligent. So overall, I think this is really cool. I love learning about the Hittites and seeing some good period accuracy. There's just some parts where I'm like, this is kind of icky. I don't know. Maybe I'm just not a shoujo person, but there's plenty of shoujo I have zero complaints about with this stuff, and it's not like cardboard personality, main character, obsessed women aren't an annoying problem in other genres, but I digress again. And they're republishing this in English now in 3-in-1 omnibus form, so it's not going to be impossible to get physical volumes anymore, and that's always a nice thing to have. Last, we've got our reverse. Paripi Koumei, which is Kongming of the Party People, or Party People Koumei, or Ya Boy Kongming. And I was today years old when I learned that Paripi is supposed to be short for party people. Okay. So I watched the anime that came out for this 2 years ago now, I guess. I thought it was based off a light novel. I was wrong. And the manga is available in English, so that's good. And this is about Kongming, or Zhujiang, or in Japanese he's Koumei. And this was a Chinese warlord from the Three Kingdoms period, I believe. And in Paripi Koumei, he appears in the modern day, and he uses his penchant for strategy to promote an idol-type singer, I guess I'd say, Eiko, who he really likes. After seeing her, right after he comes to the present, he immediately is, captured by her singing. And as far as we know, which is quite a lot, he's got a lengthy list of sources that say he's real. There's a lot of good, informative ancient Chinese resources. Those guys did a good job of writing shit down. As far as we know, Kongming was a real dude, which I was unsure of, and that's cool. So this is a reverse historical isekai type beat. He's being transported from 200 AD to the present, and every once in a while, relatively often enough, we get references to his historical battle strategies, as well as his keen diplomatic and political maneuvering that he did in ancient times. And he's using these tools now in the present that made him famous all the way to this day in order to promote Eiko. And I haven't read the manga, but consensus unfortunately seems to say that the anime is better. Luckily, I still have the movie, which I haven't seen yet, to look forward to from this one. So I would say we've got a worthwhile watch here, and there's no harm in trying out the manga. So overall, I really actually enjoyed the concept here that all these have. And I'm sure there's more like this. I kind of know that there are. Think Inuyasha almost fits the bill, except the whole demons part. I think it's even during the Sengoku period as well. I don't know, I've never consumed any of it, so I don't know. But I like the idea of knowing what's going to happen in history and either trying to change it, or maybe only knowing the general concepts, trying to make sure it still happens, for your own future, or maybe just the future in general. Or maybe you have no clue at all about the specifics and you're just along for the ride, but your future knowledge is still an advantage, and that's very interesting to see it utilized. And in all these cases, I get to learn, which is fun for me, and hopefully for you too. Adios.